And now it's time for a Geek Speak with
GK Technologies,
Sarah and Jody.
In the fields again, I just can't wait to get in the fields again. The life I love is spreading potash for my friends, and I can't wait to get in the fields again. No, I can't wait to get in the fields again.
All right, folks, we are back with part 2 of our conversation with Mr. Paul Fuller, our drainage extraordinaire here at GK Technology. And we're going to start with this part 2 of our discussion, talking a little bit about the history of drainage, what that entails, where things came from, and then, of course, go into some details about what makes a good drainage plan. How do we get to the point where we're making water flow across our fields like we want them to? So with that, Paul, if you want to tell us more about the history of drainage, we're happy to listen.
So the first time I'd heard this particular story was actually at a drainage design school, and they were, a lot of learning educational things you go to. You start out with the history of it and what we've learned from history. The first known drain tile in the United States was in the Seneca, New York area in 1838.
In 1838, they were doing drain tile? You're kidding me.
Yep. John Johnston, good old, that could be a Norwegian name, but actually sounded like he came from Scotland, but I didn't realize Johnston was a Scottish name. But it had been done there some, and so he talked to a local pottery maker, and the guy made him a bunch of clay tiles and fired them, and they put them in the ground, and initially they did 10 acres. And his neighbors were all talking about how you're going to dry it out, you're not going to grow anything, you're going to poison the soil, everything else. That his 10-acre test plot, went from 5 bushels. They didn't say what crop, but went from 5 bushel the acre pre-drainage. It was kind of a boggy, wet area, to 50 bushels per acre.
Holy cow.
And so that's in 1838. By the end of his farming career, he had a 320-acre farm, had put in 72 miles of drain tile.
Hand dug,
1-foot clay tiles. So I did a little calculations on that because inquiring minds want to know. 72 miles of tile on 320 acres figures out to between 35 and 40-foot spacing.
Wow.
Hand dug in 1838.
So we're talking like pattern tile then as well.
Patterned, full pattern tiled, yes. They also had an interview with the current owner of that farm. Much of it is still in use. So did it pay back?
Apparently. Do you know how deep that tile got dug?
Most of the old clay tiles hand dug. They talked about either 1 spade deep or 2 spades deep.
Okay.
So if you've ever seen a tiling spade, 18 inches give or take, the length of them, and so most of us put 1.5 to 2 spades deep. So 2.5, 2 to 3 feet deep would have been quite common.
It's interesting to think about the history of drain tile in the different places in the United States where we've seen some of these long-standing drain tile projects. Actually, even right outside of Halstead here, just on the other side of the river, I'm aware of an agronomy client that I worked with, and I scouted this half section pretty close to the Red River. And of course, because it's close to the Red River, it had pretty deep ditches, and river flooding in the spring of the year, big issue, right? And so these big ditches, and when this farmer started farming this half section, there was these spots in the bottom of the ditches that would just always stay wet. It wouldn't matter, what time of the year it was, but they would always stay wet. And here, what we figured is that had been hand dug tile back in the 1930s. There had been people that had come out here to the Fargo clay areas. Now we don't have that close spacing. It was just, different runs of tile. And here, this modern farmer that I was working with had, his heavy equipment had gone over the top of that clay tile after he had tried to improve the surface ditches. And so I think he dug down pretty close to that clay tile, and then his heavy equipment broke the tile, and it was always staying wet right there. But yeah, so even out here in the 1930s, not to the extent that what we see in southern Minnesota, like where you are, Paul, because drain tile is very old down there compared to what it is up here in North Dakota, right? But it is interesting to think about how effective those tiles still are, as long as they haven't broken.
Yeah, and you do see somewhere, I mean, over time, materials fail. And, but there's lots of tile. I've got a good customer in Indiana that I talk to pretty regular, and they've gone out and they've mapped all of their old clay, and some they're trying to keep in, some, into the new projects, some they're not. But the thing that blows me away is they've got a tile finder, which is basically a rod. You stick up the outlet, and you got your probe that you follow along, and you put flags of where that locator is on the rod. And sometimes they have to do some backhoe digging and stuff too to locate this tile. But then they drive it with their gator and record where it's at. They bring that into ADMS, and we watershed model versus with LiDAR or RTK collected data versus where those tile lines are at. It is absolutely amazing how good a job they did. I mean, they're within feet of where most of our main flow accumulations are.
Isn't that amazing?
And this was done pre-laser. This was done with optical transits back in the early 1900s, some even going back further than that. And how good a job they did of surveying of where that tile should go, kind of path of least resistance.
That's incredible. I mean, I'm sitting here with my mouth gaping open because I'm just amazed, because I was going to ask, how are they finding that clay tile? Like, are they doing some sort of like ground penetrating radar or something to find that hard layer? But they're literally sticking like a metal probe, right? That you can then kind of take like probably not a magnet, but like taking a location of that probe as it moves through the pipe, and then being able to map that, or like have a GPS location of that when you're done. Wow. And then, okay, so like when in the early 1900s, when they were putting this clay in and they were doing this good of job, I mean, what were they looking for? Are they looking for the same things that we are now, like looking for, the lowest spot in the field, farthest point away from the outlet? Like what were they looking for when they were doing their drainage, and how does that compare to like now?
They're really doing the exact same thing we're doing now. I mean, it was, we're looking for the spots that have lower production due to excess water. And, any good agronomists, which we're going to have a lot of agronomists listen to this program too, what is our limiting factor on most crops? It is water, either lack of or excess. Western Nebraska has a little different issue than Eastern South Dakota. As far as they're a little rain limited, and even Western North Dakota, where Jody's from, you're more rain limited than we are in Eastern North Dakota, Eastern South Dakota, and then into Minnesota. So, you can see that excess water and the problems it causes, the yellowing in crops because of wet roots, lack of nitrogen due to desertification. Those are all aspects that apply towards, we need to fix it. Well, people were smart, 150 years ago too, and they just they could see those spots. Now they were usually doing a lot more targeted versus full pattern tile, just because the payback, if you're going to go out and hand dig in a 5-inch clay tile line, I want to put it where it's most effective. And that was long before our modern, putting tile in now is easy. The planning still takes a little work, but the putting it in is easy now. So let's look at the economics of it. Of course, economics have changed too, from farm ground being worth, $100 an acre. My dad bought his first farm at $100 an acre, and the whole township thought he was nuts and was going to go broke. And it's literally some of the best ground in our township. He got kind of fortunate, bought some good ground to start out with. And I'd hate to guess what it's worth now. Just looking at current commodity prices or current land prices, pushing $30,000 an acre for farm ground in Northwest Iowa here recently.
Book tomato.
Yeah, with tomato. The economics of things have changed. Input costs. Look at the cost of your inputs. Look at the cost of your equipment. Efficiency. Farms are not getting any smaller. As farms get larger, we need to be more efficient. So when we're running larger equipment, being able to go straight back and forth across the field has a lot of value. Instead of trying to put a headland along a wet area, and now we've got 400-foot runs instead of half-mile long runs back and forth with the corn planter and every other process throughout the year. So efficiency is a big thing there.
So Paul, when you're going to start creating a surface, you start a drain tile plan with a surface drainage plan, right?
Yes.
So let's start with surface drainage. When you start a surface drainage plan, how do you approach that? What are you doing to be successful with surface drainage planning?
The biggest thing is kind of looking at the elevation of the field. For surface drainage, I don't even look at an aerial image of the field to start out with. I may look for some existing ditches or stuff like that, but primarily I'm looking at the elevation and seeing where I need to crop my boundary. One thing with surface drainage is your field boundary may or may not ever be your actual drainage boundary.
Meaning your tillage boundary might be different than your drainage. Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
And with tile, it's a whole nother level, but we'll talk surface drainage first. So on surface drainage, our general theory, and I got to give Kelly Sharp credit for this. Kelly really taught me surface drainage, something that I had limited knowledge of before I came to work for GK. We need to get water off the field. So basically we need to get water to the road ditch, but maybe not include the road ditch because of potential false elevations or readings in vegetative areas. Vegetation is kind of LIDAR's enemy. And but if we can get water to the road ditch, in theory, the road ditch should take it away. However, road ditches are not necessarily on grade. They were borrow pits to build the road.
Ooh, that's a good point. Okay. And let's back up a second too. When we're thinking about making these watershed plans, what data we're using to put that together? That's typically LIDAR, right? Can you talk a little bit more about when they're collecting that data? Why does vegetation cause issues?
Talk about LIDAR and what it is and how it works.
So LIDAR is aerial flown elevation data. I'm sure some of our listeners are hunters. So if you're a hunter or if you're a home remodeler or anything else, you may have used LIDAR in theory. So if you ever use a laser rangefinder from the one that you put it in the edge of the room and it reads across the wall the other side and says this room is 14.3 feet wide, there's an elk out there and I get out my rangefinder, my hunting rangefinder, that elk is 647 yards away. And now I can adjust the elevation on my scope for that yardage. It's the same general theory. So basically, twin engine planes are flown. They have RTK GPS on them, reading off, we'll call it local base stations for their project area. And they have a really, really fancy laser rangefinder that sends out near infrared laser pulses. When those pulses go down, hit the ground, and come back up, or I should say when they hit a surface, not ground, when they hit a surface, they bounce back up, and it's all timing. They fly at about around 7,000 feet, give or take. The timing of how long it takes, just like GPS is timing of how long it takes to get to point A to point B. So the cool thing is, and Kelly's always had a thing in our training class deal about these LIDAR transmitters send out 250,000 pulses per second. And that's not even impressive anymore. That data is from about 2008 or 9. Now they are pushing 1 billion points. So, it's just huge amounts of data.
And one of the things that's always baffled my mind with LIDAR is the accuracy. In the Red River Valley of North Dakota, Minnesota, we used a LIDAR really came into being for drainage planning for all of the flooding that we have in the Red River Valley. So they flew the Red River Valley. And it sure sounded like it was pretty accurate data. And they flew the whole area from Fargo all the way up to Winnipeg. And I think they said it was like a 6-inch accuracy from Fargo to Winnipeg on the original data that was flown like in the 2000s. Does that ring a bell to you, Paul?
Yes, and that is actually, so ground elevation, every point within that project, every ground point within that project is within plus or minus 6 inches, which you might think, wow, that's, I've only got a foot of fall across my field. But that's from the accuracy from Lake Traverse on the South Dakota, Minnesota line, all the way up to Winnipeg. And so from point to point, the accuracy, I haven't seen a published spec on it, but I mean, it's millimeter level stuff. But yeah, for every ground hit point, so that's in we'll call it the tilled part of the field, the roads, the stuff like that. Every point is within 6 inches. We live by it. I hear other people. I'm kind of involved with some social media stuff and some forums online, and people talk about how bad LiDAR is. And it's like, LiDAR is not the problem. It's your software that's reading it. And there's a couple of pretty major ones out there that are kind of competitors to us that, one has always said LiDAR is bad until their customers figure out a way to finally get LiDAR into it by bringing it through several software packages and changing formats and stuff, and then finally be able to bring it in. But they've always said it's bad. Well, no, the LiDAR is not bad. The way you read LiDAR is not good.
And I think that's a really important point. I think bar none, we can make a pretty good argument that the Red River Valley of North Dakota, northern Minnesota, especially where we're in the bottom of Lake Agassiz, is one of the flattest areas that exists. And I mean, we're talking fields that are half section in size, that you're going to have less than a foot of drop across the entire field, across that entire mile. And I know that I have created surface drainage maps with LiDAR through our software, and I've had extremely happy farmers, and they've been able to make really good decisions off of that drainage in a very flat area, because the data from that LiDAR is so accurate. And so, yeah, it's great. It works well. You have to be able to use it right. Data is no good unless you can use the data properly, to Paul's point. But I do think it's really important to remember just what great data we have with that product.
Yeah, and that kind of leads to the drawback to LiDAR. I mean, LiDAR is awesome in-field, we'll call it. Surface drainage, we're typically just draining in-field. So it works awesome for that. When it comes to tile, typically our outlet is outside of the field. We don't outlet into the field unless there happens to be a major creek or a deep drainage ditch that goes through the actual field. So where LiDAR can have issues is vegetative areas. And so with tile, typically that's our outlets, whether it be a road ditch, a county drainage ditch like the southern Minnesota stuff, creeks, streams. I've outletted into dugouts quite frequently because it gives me outlet depth. And we're filling the dugout up, but then once the dugout gets full, it flows out. So that we can put outlets on the other side or inlets on the other side to capture the water to get it back underground again. Kind of use the dugout as a settling pond a little bit, or a retention basin. And so when this near infrared LiDAR laser hits a surface, so whether that's a tree leaf or a tree branch or a blade of grass or soil or a road or a building, they actually go through and classify all that stuff. And I don't know the whole process there. That's way above my head. But they'll end up with numerous classifications where they've got ground hits is the main classification, but they've got low vegetation, mid vegetation, high vegetation buildings. And so it's flown, actually, it's captured aerial imagery while they're flying it also. And they have ground control point, big X's put on the ground that are their reference points that they actually ground truth with RTK. So those vegetative points where you hit a tree branch in a tree belt instead of hitting the ground. So it bounces back up.
Now, to that point, I mean, obviously, when you're making a drain tile plan, you're going to want to make sure you have a working outlet. I mean, let's just be real with ourselves. That's a pretty important component of the whole thing, making sure we've got
It is the most important thing.
Thank you. So, but to that point, and I mean, we're getting those great data off of the surface, but a lot of times we'll want to go back out there, maybe an in-person ground truth, what that actual depth is, or that elevation, and through that vegetative area. You know, like let's say that you've got that ditch and it's got a lot of cattails in it or whatever, and so we're getting maybe some false readings off of that LiDAR right there, but you can get down in there and with your GPS and RTK that point and blend that into the LiDAR, so you know what your outlet is. Is that correct, Paul?
Yes. Yeah, we can use RTK. Actually, that's a good spot for a laser. A laser can almost be easier to set up for something like that, where if I can get a reading off the road and the ditch bottom right beside the road, that's all I need. So I know where that actual in relationship to the road. We can do the same with RTK, but I actually just recently did a project in Iowa that I needed a couple of outlet verification points because according to the LiDAR, it wasn't deep enough. I'm not going to take a chance of saying, okay, this project's all going to work, and okay, no, we're not deep enough to start. And the way it laid, it was just kind of one of those, I had the outlet here and here, kind of split the project into two different parts. And when they came through and then they went out with a laser, and I said, okay, take a reading of the road and the bottom of that creek and a couple different spots. And I had 2 feet more to work with than what the LiDAR showed, because LiDAR also reflects off water. So if there was water in the creek when they flew it, that recorded as surface.
Absolutely. So there's a little bit of ground truthing, especially when we're getting into something like doing our actual drain tile plans, and we want stuff to be, obviously exact. This is when you put in a drain tile, it's a pretty big, that's a big commitment. And so we want to make sure the planning is done correctly.
Yes, it is. The outlet is the number one key thing. If we don't have an outlet, we don't have a project. Now that outlet could be a pumped outlet. People say, I don't have an outlet. Well, everybody can have an outlet. We may have to go 3 miles to get to it. We may have to pump it with a lift station, but everybody's got an outlet. We just have to find it and maybe improvise a little bit.
It's probably a good place to start with talking about drain tile planning. We've talked a little bit about surface drainage and everything like that. I know whenever I've gotten any advice from you or from Kelly about drain tile planning, it's always about starting with the outlet. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about how you get started with your drain tile planning? And I also want to put a plug in for our ADMS software users. We have some pretty big tutorials online when you log into our website. If you're a software user, you should have that login. And if you go on there, we have a bunch of help videos. And one of those videos Paul did, and it's about drain tile. And one of the things that he does in that drain tile planning video that I think is incredibly valuable is he kind of helps you think through a little bit about the actual drainage design a little bit. And so it's kind of a nice place to sort of start with that. So if you haven't taken that in and you are interested in doing drain tile planning, I highly suggest it. But anyway, sorry, I went off on a tangent there, Paul. But why don't you tell us how you like to get started with your tile planning?
Well, basically, when a customer talks to me about doing some tile planning, the first thing I say is I need a legal description. That's we gotta have that. Where the heck am I working? And then I get some other information from them too. Is do you know where your outlet, where you think you want an outlet? Before I even look at it, most people in their mind, they know, okay, I need an outlet to this ditch, or I need an outlet to this cattail slough or whatever it is. And just to kind of get an idea, so we're on the same page right off the bat. Then I do the watershed modeling, and there is times where I say, oh, no, we aren't going there. That's not the right place to go. And so get as much information as that from them at the beginning. Do the watershed modeling so that I know where water should go. And at that point, I also draw in a couple of proposed mains. So the first information that I send to them is the surface drainage and a few proposed mains that kind of say, okay, here's where water should go. Can we outlet? The LiDAR says we can outlet here, or the LiDAR says we need to be 2 foot deeper than what this is showing for the outlet. So at that point, I get that outlet collection from them. Um, and then we start talking about tile spacing. Some people say, hey, I want to go 60-foot spacing. Perfect. So we'll say, well, what would you suggest? What kind of, I don't know what I should do. What spacing should I do? And so I use some online calculators that I trust, and just to kind of give an idea of here's what I would suggest. You do what you want, but here would be a suggestion from me. And there's quite a few people that say, everybody around here has always done 60-foot spacing, but I don't think it's enough. And so what do you want to do? You want to go 50? You want to go down to 40? You want to go down to 30? You want to cut it in half? And there's just lots of different ways to do that. And but I trust the calculators that I use at least as a pretty good guide based on Surgo soil maps, which that's the only thing I really truly use them for. They're not right, but if they say there's a Tonka or Parnell soil in this depressional area of this field, they're probably right. The delineation of it is by far from perfect, but at least I trust that soil is in that depression.
And you can find the major soil textural changes with that data. It'll help you. I agree. Those lines aren't going to be exact. They did a really good job with the technology that they had at the time that they developed those. It's not going to be exact. But at the same time, if there's a big, huge soil textural change going from a clay to a sand, you're going to be able to find that with that information.
Yeah, so that's kind of one step of the process, and we need to figure out what we're going to do for spacing. Red River Valley, where GK is located, it's primarily full pattern tile, and it's a case of it's a dang flat. Where do you start? Where do you start? Where do you stop? So it's pretty much full pattern. I do a lot of spot tile in more prairie pothole type country. Where our hilltops, now this all depends on rainfall. Now prairie pothole, North Dakota, South Dakota versus prairie pothole, central Iowa is a little different, just due to rainfall. And I believe like Clark, South Dakota, I believe our annual rainfall average is like 23 or 25 inches, somewhere in that area. You get across the border into Minnesota, it goes up about 5 inches right there. As you get further east, traditionally, a lot of places are in that 35, even 40-inch rainfall. Just recently worked with a customer in Alabama that they're like in 55 or 58-inch annual rainfall.
Wow.
So they get a little more heat to help take care of some of that too. But, that's we got to plan differently for 50 inches of rainfall versus 25. And so those all kind of come into effect, when we start talking drainage coefficient, which is basically how many acre inches of water can I move off a field in a day? And it's actually in parts of inches. It's not inches. You couldn't afford to tile for 1 inch or 2 inch drainage coefficient on everything. But I should say maybe you could. But the economic feasibility of it becomes gets pretty tough at that point. So unless you're on a specialty crop like tomatoes, grapes, peppers, more specialty crop type stuff.
And that's such a good point too, because like you think about where we are in the Red River Valley versus the rainfall farther east, right? We probably don't need to worry about draining off 3 inches in a day because it's a one-time rain event, right? We can deal with draining less over time because we don't have as many rain events and we don't get as much rain as they do farther east. So that makes a big difference when we're thinking about these things too.
And that's where your surface drainage comes in for those 3-inch rain events.
Yes.
That's why they really need to complement each other well.
Yes.
That's great. So, this has just been so fascinating. I've really enjoyed this conversation because we've really dived into a lot of the concrete things that we think about when we're trying to develop, what data sources are we using for topography? How are we thinking about the surface drainage? How does that complement and work with drain tile? And how are we planning that all out? And this might back up the conversation just a little bit, but I do want to ask this question. We talked a lot about LIDAR earlier. Are there any other data sources that you would use for topography in addition to, or in places where you might have the absence of LIDAR?
Yeah. So another data source that we have is called SRTM. and it was flown with the space shuttle. It's a radar technology instead of a laser technology. And now the problem with it is the resolution. In most of the U.S., it's 10-meter resolution. So basically, you have we'll call it a data point every 30 square feet, or every, what would that be? 30 times 30, every 900 square feet. So 10 meter, 33 foot pixels basically of elevation. So we lose the resolution. However, the generalities are right. It's just that we don't have the detail. And that's available for pretty much the whole U.S. The nice thing about that is it's radar instead of laser. So it did penetrate vegetation. It also penetrates water to, I can't remember whether it's 2 meters, 3 meters, something in that area. It actually penetrates water. So the space shuttle was cruising around the Earth and collected the whole world at 30-meter resolution, and made additional passes over the U.S. and some other specific areas to collect 10-meter resolution data. And I have used that to fill in some weaknesses of LiDAR, like cattail sloughs. Some areas that were flown during wet periods, and we had a lot more cattails and vegetation there. So literally crop out that area that I can see as false on the LiDAR and fill it in with the SRTM. We call it our NED data in our data sets.
That's so smart. I'm just sitting back here thinking that was really, really smart to fill in. That's genius.
And we can also take RTK collected data. So drive your ditch bottoms. Maybe you cut a new ditch into a field, a pretty major ditch. We're not talking just a little 2-inch, field ditch. Cut something pretty major through the field since the LiDAR was flown. You can go drive that ditch bottom as well as some undisturbed area, and we can literally burn that newly collected RTK data into the existing LiDAR and actually update the LiDAR.
And I have done that too. In my independent crop consulting days, I actually did that where I went and drove some ditch bottoms and some roads to mark and updated some LiDAR for a couple of clients. It does work pretty well. It is a big time commitment though, because you actually do need to be recording that RTK data correctly, and you need to blend it together correctly. But if you have that major ditch, boy, it can be a big difference for making sure we're working off of a good data layer.
Yep.
And that is included in the training class for drainage in the morning, going over how to take that RTK data and make it as an elevation layer for using and utilizing within ADMS.
Yeah, it's something I don't do a lot in practice. I mean, but when I need to do it, it's something that works very, very well. One thing I'd like to touch on too, just a little bit, is so we've been talking primarily drainage, water management. We've used that term several times too. I'd like to talk just a little bit about alternative water management.
Yes.
And to me, this is something that's, we're looking at primarily removing excess water to grow a better crop. And there is some other things out there too that I just want to touch on a little bit. So conservation drainage, as a general nutshell, is we drain it down in the spring, we get everything planted, we put in stop blocks to actually now hold water back up into the field. So it's controlled drainage.
You're talking about this on a drain tile project, right? So
Yep.
So you leave it all the way open in the spring of the year, and then you've got a structure in there that you can actually, it's almost like a drain tile block, so you can kind of hold the water back then.
Yeah, so it's a control structure that actually they put, usually they've got 6-inch stop blocks, so you can adjust the elevation of the water table by 6-inch increments. And so the theory behind it is, so I get it nice and dried off nice so I can get everything planted and start getting some roots established and everything. And then I start holding water back. So I actually raise the water table to hold some of my water back there for future use in the field. So throughout the summer, as now we have excess water held there so the crops can use it. And they take management. It's one of those things that, we get a big rain, you probably want to go pull those blocks for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, put your blocks back in. Now let's not drain it all off, but let's hold some more back. The biggest thing is topography. It's very, very expensive to do in rolling terrain. In the Red River Valley, it's quite that 1 foot of elevation change in the field. That makes it easy.
I never thought about it because I suppose when you put that, if you've got a lot of topography, basically you're trying to push water uphill.
Yes. And so, as a general rule, you need a set of control structures for every foot to 18 inches of elevation change.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I actually designed a sub-irrigation project, which kind of goes conservation drainage to the next step, or controlled drainage to the next step, of actually pumping water back into the tile system to irrigate underground. We had some stuff, and it was a really odd-shaped field. The customer has a lot of he has surface irrigation also. Odd-shaped pieces don't work good for center pivots. When you got really odd-shaped, smaller 20-acre field, this one happened to be. But in that 20 acres, there was also about 25 feet of elevation change.
Oh, wow. Huh.
And so basically it was going to be about 25 control structures. I laid it all for him. I don't think he ended up installing it. Sometimes we had one tile line off a control structure because that was that 1 foot of elevation. And so basically you can hold that water back. So we irrigate each area separately, and you can actually control areas. You can drain more out of one area. You can hold more in other areas also.
Wow. So when you've done, in your experience working with drain tile, you haven't just done drainage. You have actually used drain tile to manage water, to make sure that there's also water there throughout the season.
Yes, and that's it's water management, and sometimes it's to remove excess, sometimes it's to hold some back. Another project that I work with is using tile to collect water for irrigation. So basically drain tile water recycling. And I've got a client in California, in Napa County. I'll throw that out there. So if any of you are wine drinkers,
let's go get some wine.
I'm not a wine drinker myself, but any of you other wine drinkers, everybody's heard of Napa, California. I mean, that is probably the premium wine producing area in the United States. The customers that I work with are in a valley. They're not in Napa Valley. They're in the next valley east, and there's no water. The large reservoirs that were built back in the 20s, 30s, 40s for irrigation, and these different areas all bought into being part of that. This area was all cows.
Interesting.
We don't need irrigation for cows. So it's really good soil. It's the weather conditions are just like Napa Valley. Napa Valley, you can't plant another grapevine unless you take out a flower pot or a piece of sidewalk. There's not room for another, okay, we'll buy your house for $1 million and tear it down to put in an extra half an acre of grapes. Because there's no more room. And it's been developed totally. So they're in the next valley east. So they have no water source. And when I was out there I actually went to California and got them set up going. They said the difference between irrigated grapes and non-irrigated grapes is about 10 tons per acre. And at that time, market value on wine grapes was about $1,500 a ton.
Wow.
So for $15,000 per acre, we can do some work to try to help this. And so I went out them, got them going with SD Drain, and their tile plow, and they knew nothing. So I kind of taught them how to tile, how to do everything else. And they had an engineer drop a plan for this. Nothing against engineers. Engineers are smart people, very well educated people. But just because you're an engineer does not mean you know anything about drainage. And unfortunately, I looked at their plan and I said, no, we got to do something different here. So
not even a nice try, but no.
You know what? I'm honest about this. I am forward on stuff. I have no problem calling a spade a spade. And if you're doing something wrong, I will point it out to you and say, here, I'm nice, but I'll say, no, that's not right. We got to do this differently. In my hotel room that night, I used SRTM 10-meter data, because there was no LiDAR available for that particular area of California at the time. And I basically drew up a plan for them. It was not significantly different from what the engineers had done, but they went all straight uphill. And this is not a flat valley. It's got some topography, and they want to capture water. They really don't need drainage. I did do a project for them a couple of years ago where actually the drainage was going to help them because they were actually getting some wet feet in grapes. But their biggest thing is in that particular area, they get all their precipitation between October and March when nothing's growing.
And they wanted to capture that.
And so they cannot capture surface water. Like they can't take water out of a creek because somebody owns the rights to that water.
Oh.
But whatever falls on their ground and doesn't leave their ground, they can capture. So we have a couple other challenges too. So basically, if everybody's seen grapevines, they're all grown on trellises.
Mm-hmm.
Those poles go 4 feet in the ground.
Ooh.
So when we design, we can either design around the trellises would be an option, but we typically we don't design around the trellises. We basically make sure they're deep enough. So most of the tile lines are at 4.5 foot deep. They have fairly heavy clay soils. And typically from 20 to some of the lighter, the loamier stuff is, at 60-foot spacings. And it all goes to a sump and gets pumped back up into a reservoir right on the property.
Wow.
And they've been pretty successful with it because I was first out there in the summer of 2016, and I've done at least one project a year for them since.
Wow.
That is a cool story.
Yes.
They're one of 2 companies in California that they know of doing this for this exact purpose. And they're running a tile plow. The other one's running a chain trencher with grade control on it. But then they're putting rock down. They're putting stone, small, 1/2 inch to inch stone down with it to kind of make an envelope around the rock or around the tile to actually try to get better drainage, which is not a bad idea. It's also a lot more expensive too. But it's not a bad thing. But these guys are having great luck. A project I did a couple years for them, they said, I think we over-designed it. Their 3 or 4 acre reservoir was full by May, and which is good. And the first year, and they actually thought they designed it for 2 years capacity.
So they had enough water then to water for the whole growing
for 2 years by May of the first year.
Amazing.
And so we ended up on just a little, and now they're getting, right now California's getting extreme rains. They've been very, very wet, but that doesn't happen all the time. So they plan for 2. They've got enough capacity to irrigate for 2 years out of it.
That was a great story. And really, really great way to think about drain tile from a very different perspective and a different way of managing water. This has just been such a fun conversation.
Yes, it has. I thank you so much for your time, Paul. It's been great to listen to your stories and listen about the history of tile drainage and just pick your brain and learn.
And I don't want to get too far off the topic here, but I do think we need to give Paul's better half, Kendra. Paul's a pretty amazing guy, but boy, you should meet Kendra. She's really amazing. And I think it's important to give her a big shout out because she is actually the one that developed the name of our podcast. When we were coming up with the name of the podcast, we just email it out to the entire company. And Kendra's the one that came back with Egg Geek Speak. So thank you to Kendra. We appreciate you very much. And she's actually responsible for making sure that our servers have, if you use our software, she is the person that's does a lot of making sure that our servers are stocked full with recent up-to-date data and imagery. So we appreciate her efforts there as well.
One more quick little thing I want to add here, just as we're kind of getting towards the end, is just a little bit of theory on drainage. And this is really simple. This is a really simple deal. Starting with this in a time when, drainage was not really common. So we all learned and we all made mistakes along the way. Kind of like in agriculture, there's no mistakes. They're just accidental test plots. It's kind of that same thing. So as we've been going, as I've been going along, I'm learning from my customers. I talk to my customers. We talk about how did that help that field, and well, I've had you do 4 more fields since then, so I think you know how it worked. But let's talk bushels. But the biggest thing that we sell software to do tile planning. We do tile planning. I mean, as a custom operation, for our customers. So we can sell you the software to do it. We can do it for you, even if you're using somebody else's software plan. And the biggest tip I can leave with anybody is I've never heard anybody say, I wish I'd put a smaller main in or put my tile farther apart.
Oh, those are hot tips.
That's
the reality. I mean, it's, plan for the future, not necessarily just for today.
Well, and it's a big investment. I mean, this isn't just an investment that you make for a 1-year crop. It's something that you're going to have for a long time.
Yep, especially if that clay tile is going to be there for as long as it is. Think about the plastic tile is going to be there just as long too.
Thank you, Paul, for those words of wisdom. Remember, keep your outlets and your mains big and effective, and keep your tile spacing close. And with that, thank you, Paul, for your time. It's been a great conversation. At GK Technology, we have a map
And an app
for that.
No, I can't wait to get in the fields again.
Let the geeks at GK Technology help you with your agricultural data. Their agronomists know agriculture. When it comes to creating soils and zone maps to maximize yields in your fields, you can trust the people with decades of experience in site-specific agriculture. Everyone at GK Technology has a background in agriculture, so they know what makes a farm run, and they speak your language. The geeks at GK Technology have a map and an app for that.